Show you here just a mock-up of exactly how the floor construction was accomplished. Imagine that this bench top here, this is our poured concrete floor. Imagine that this piece of wood is our concrete wall. Okay, so we have our concrete foundation wall and floor. This is our 2-inch of XPS foam insulation up against the wall. And this is our Super Seal carpet and laminate subfloor dimple mat, which is our moisture and vapor barrier on the floor. As I mentioned in a previous video, the dimple mat is underneath our wall insulation by about 1 inch. So we have the insulation overlapping. And the dimple mat actually has 2 different sides to it. If you notice, if you can see it in the video, this side has a little bit more of a rounded end of dimples, and on the opposite side, the dimples are a little bit more flattened out. Since we're going to be putting our foam on top of the dimples, I use the flat side to the top. It'll help to distribute load a little bit more evenly through the foam. And on the bottom, where we have the rounded dimples, that means we're going to have more area and space in between the dimples, which will allow for easier airflow and moisture movement underneath if and when we ever need it. When we're building our floor, you can see that we have our dimple mat, then our 1-inch thick of XPS foam. This is an R5 insulation value, and then we have our subfloor material. When I lay my first layer of dimple mat, I said how I laid it up underneath the wall insulation. When I put my next layer down, I'm going to make sure that I'm putting the correct rounded dimple side down again. That's going to set, the dimples are basically going to set into themselves. I'm overlapping by about 1 inch, 1.5 inches. And in between that, I'm laying a bead of GE silicone 2 caulking. It's a mold-free caulking that will remain flexible through the life of the caulk. So I lay a bead of that caulk in between the 2 layers of dimple mat. And then just to hold it together during the construction phase, I'm using some Gorilla Tape also after I lay the caulk and running the Gorilla Tape over the 2 seams. This helps to hold the layers of dimple mat together just so that while I'm walking on it and moving around through the construction phase, it's going to stay in place, keep caulk beads in place, because we're dealing with big areas on the floor, and I want to make sure I'm not screwing up the work that I already did to begin with. After I have my layers of dimple mat down, I'm going to make sure that I'm trying to butt up the seams, and some of these pieces are also going to have tongue and groove in them. I'm going to use the tongue and groove wherever I can. For the sake of the bench mock-up, I'm just going to show 2 cut edges together. So on top of the dimple mat, if I can, I'm overlapping the joints between the foam and the dimple mat as much as I can, just to make sure that we're getting staggered joints. I'm going to butt up my insulation or use the tongue and groove, and then I'm going to seal with our Tyvek house wrap tape all the way around, all the joints. So now when we're building our foam insulation on the floor, a couple important points to remember. Like I mentioned previously in a video, we want to make sure that we have a little bit of a gap all the way along the wall. So I'm leaving at least 1/8 inch to 1/4 gap between the insulation. This just allows for some expansion and to make sure we're not having the floor foam rub up against the wall foam. It can result in things like some squeaking or noise or other things, so just a little bit of clearance is good. Also, putting a bead of the GE silicone 2 caulk between the wall foam and the dimple mat. So all the way along the floor, I've caulked in between there before I laid down my foam as well. For the subfloor, I'm using a product called Advantech. Advantech is specifically made as a subflooring product. It's not just a particle board. It is a particle board that is in floor. Again, we're going to put the board right in line, or generally in line, with our layer of insulation. Again, with at least 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch of gap all the way along the wall. When you do this, you should be measuring your wall, and you're going to have some waviness or potential distortion to the wall because of the way the concrete was formed. So you're going to want to look and see where your high points are in the wall and make sure that your gap is all the way along. So we put our first boards down, use the tug and grooving connection wherever we can. Where we have a cut end joint, we're going to leave a little bit of a gap. Manufacturer's recommendation is 1/8 inch, and that's for additional expansion purposes, thermal expansion purposes. Also to make sure, like the foam, you don't have cut ends rubbing up against each other with any movement in the floor, causing squeaking or noises or that kind of thing as well. For all of the joints, including tongue and groove joints, so if we've got some tongue and groove connections there, and we've got our butt end, what I did is I used these framing straps just to provide a little extra stiffness to the construction. So laid down and tacked in framing straps across the joints here, also across the tongue and groove joints in this way as well. So the reason I did that is, again, the floor is floating. There is going to be some expansion of the materials with changes in temperatures and seasons and so on, changes in temperatures of our concrete floor and the walls. This is just going to provide another mechanism to help hold everything together. It will actually stiffen it up, maybe even prevent or restrict a little bit of that expansion and contraction, but it's not going to be to the point that it's going to be detrimental to our construction. You can see here an example in line along that chalk line, so that I know it's in the right position. And I'm just going to give it one more check, and then I'm going to screw that to the floor. Again, we're building our walls on top of the floating subfloor, and I don't want to penetrate through the vapor barriers and really not penetrate through the insulation. So I'm using 2.5-inch deck screws, and that's going to get me through the 1.5-inch of the plate, and then it's basically about just shy of an inch thickness on the subfloor. So that screw is going to give me bite all the way through the subfloor and just a little bit more, but it's going to be able to hold that subfloor. You can see the thickness here. Here's a piece of the foam. What we're using to secure these are 2.5-inch deck screws. So when we sink that deck screw to the top of that plate, you can see that at 2.5 inches, that deck screw is going to penetrate just beyond the bottom of our Advantech subfloor. It's going to come through by about maybe an eighth to a 1/4 inch there, roughly about an eighth. But you can see that it allows us to have the threads of that screw bite all the way into the subfloor, the thickness of the subfloor. And that screw is going to penetrate through a little bit to the foam, but nowhere near enough to compromise the moisture and vapor barrier that we've created. So here you can see, and I put this really close to the edge of the wood, which you wouldn't normally be doing, but just to give a demonstration, you can see that the screw has come all the way down and just through the bottom of the subfloor layer, right there. And so when this wall is set on top of our foam, like it will be here, the edge of that screw is going to penetrate that deep into the foam, which is not compromising anywhere near our insulation value, creating any kind of thermal bridge between the screw, the floor, or the concrete that would be underneath it. And again, we have our dimple mat vapor barrier underneath all of that as well. You can see how that construction will ultimately work. But now I've got my bottom plate right in line along that chalk line, so that I know it's in the right position. Now I'm going to screw the bottom plate first, and we'll worry about the top plate afterwards. Get the bottom plate on our mark so it's in position, and then we'll worry about leveling the rest of our wall and screwing up into the joists.